Andy, Olena, Michael, and Vitor.
Send me the video.
Your timekeeper is Jen. Wave, Jen. Without further ado, I'd like to call upon the Prime Minister to open this round of debate with a 7 or 6 minute speech. 7 minute speech. Okay. Here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The motion that we bring before you today is that this House would halt the search for a gay gene. So we have to understand that we know these things aren't necessarily dichotomous. It's not sort of like people are gay or they're heterosexual, but we must understand that there is current biological research going on in terms to understand the genetic origin of people's sexual orientations, right? So we understand that it might not be a single gene, and it's not like gay or heterosexual, but there is research going on in terms of like where sexuality comes from and looking at whether it comes from a biological origin or not. So we think essentially in terms of a model what this would mean, there would be no government funding for any research in that area, and we would strongly encourage institutions who engage in that sort of research not to do so. So there's 3 reasons why we think searching for the gay gene is actually harmful to our social progress as a society rather than beneficial, even though it might solve the sort of nature versus nurture sort of choice aspect of the gay rights debate. So the first thing we want to talk about is how the immutability of your sexual orientation should be irrelevant. We think we win the argument in terms of gay rights as a society without it being an immutable, non-choice. We want to talk about how this enables avenues for eugenics. And thirdly, we want to talk about how it enables the medicalization of homosexuality. So let's talk about the idea of immutability. Because you understand, like, you hear a lot of the discourse that happens about gay rights and talking about homophobia and whether it should be legitimate or not. People say things like, do you remember back when you chose to be straight? Right? That's a common refutation that comes like from So we think that it's obviously an important question, just like whether it's a choice or not. Because people are like, well, if it's not a choice, then it's not okay to discriminate against it. We think that's really silly. We don't think it would be any more okay to be homophobic if it was actually a choice. We think there's a much better metric for deciding that question that has nothing to do with whether it's an immutable characteristic. And we think that that metric is essentially the harm principle, right? We think the reason that we should not be homophobic, the reason that we should enable gay rights, the reason that we should make a space in our society for people with that preference is because they're acts in between consenting adults that do not harm people outside of the consent that's going on, right? Like, that's what our metric should be. That metric is stronger than one of immutability or choice. We think that, like, if people could show that pedophilia was immutable, it would not all of a sudden make it okay, right? If people show that you could be born with pedophilia, it wouldn't be like, okay, wow, we really need to protect those people. Because we understand that there's a harm there, right? And the harm is more important than the immutability. Similarly, we think that alcoholism, or like drug use, is okay even if it's not genetic, right? Like, it wouldn't matter if that was genetic or not. The fact that it doesn't harm people outside of that area of consent in terms of a rational adult making rational calculus is why we're okay with it, right? It doesn't matter if it is genetic or isn't. We're okay with it because of the issue of harms. So we think that, like, the gay rights movement has been making lots of progress in terms of breaking down homophobia, in terms of, like, we think we can do that in the same way in terms of the harm principle argument, in terms of a rights argument in that way and an argument of consent. We don't think we need immutability and that idea of choice to win the argument. So that's why we don't think we get any benefits from finding engaging. Let's talk about the harms. The first thing that we get here is avenues for eugenics. We think it's important for us as a society to deal with important rights questions, right? There are obviously homosexual people in our society. We think we need to come to terms with the question about how to address the tension that exists between those people and, like, homophobes. We think that's an important question for us to have and for us to finish sort of addressing that question as a society and not allow that question to be avoided. What we think happens when you discover the genetic basis for sexual orientation is that you allow people to do things like test their fetuses and then abort them if they are gay. Because it's easier for that person, I mean, if they're homophobic, like, obviously they're going to do it. But we think even, like, innocent, non-homophobic parents might consider doing the same thing. Just because a homosexual child is going to undergo, like, a lot more hardship and teasing during their life. And we think that's a legitimate ethical choice for them to make. But we don't want them to make that choice because it shrinks the homosexual community and really undermines our ability to address that question as a society. Sure.
Okay, so if we buy that you shouldn't have, these eugenics against having a gay baby, why don't we just ban that instead of research into the genetics of being gay?
Right, okay. So I think that's a different debate, right? Like, we're sort of talking about what the implications implications are when you find the gene, the sorts of other debates that we would need to have. Right? We think that we can sort of make the decision now to not open that question out for debate and not have it be sort of a rights question. Because we think that, like, even if that was the issue, there would be lots of states, lots of governments that would allow you to do that. Right? Like, that would be the nature of the political capital and, like, the political ideology of those states. They would allow people to abort fetuses that were gay. Right? Like, we don't think we can necessarily say that that won't happen. But if we don't find the gay gene to begin with, it can't happen. So we think that's pretty important. We think that what happens when you allow people to dodge that question and, like, not have a gay baby, what you do is you necessarily shrink the gay community, and you make it less important for us to deal with that question in terms of rights, even though lots of other homosexual people are going to continue to exist and deserve protection. We think a lot of what the homosexual movement gets in terms of, like, their legitimacy and their persuasion and their ability to persuade the rest of society is, first of all, their size. Like, they need numbers. But more importantly, they need diversity of origin. We think it really helps the homosexual rights movement when a gay baby is born into, like, an ultra-conservative family. And that family is, like, forced to deal with that issue. And there's this sort of exposure that nobody planned for. And sort of you get more exposure to gay people in more avenues of society when those people can arise from anywhere. We think those ultra-conservative families will probably abort that fetus if you find the gene, and then you don't sort of force that exposure, you don't force that rights discussion.
Sure, some families change their views, some families don't change their views, send their kid to some school in the United States that's meant to change their sexuality, and the kid kills themselves.
Right, okay, I see what you're saying there too. And we think that our third point, like, addresses that to some degree, right? Like, we think that we've done a pretty good job, first of all, in terms of things like the It Gets Better campaign, showing people that they have resources, and dealing with that kind of issue. Like, I think we're making a lot of progress in that area. But the third point I want to talk about is how this enables the medicalization of homosexuality. Because understand that the first step towards finding a cure for gayness is to know where that comes from genetically and be able to suppress that gene. So we think it opens that avenue up as well. And we think it allows people then to make the choice to be homosexual or not. And lots of people will make the choice to be heterosexual simply because it's difficult to be a homosexual person in our society. And that would be a legitimate choice. But we think that hurts everyone else who is gay. Everyone else who chooses to be homosexual or, like, just continue with their current relationship and family, which is founded on homosexuality instead of heterosexuality. It hurts them because it shrinks the community. And we think when you are able to medicalize it, it makes it look like a disorder. It makes it look like it really is other. It really is abnormal when you do that sort of thing. It justifies ancient notions about curing homosexuality and it being a disease, right? So we think that if you're worried about things like, sending people off to a place where this thing might be addressed, we don't want to show that there's a biological basis for it. We don't want to show that there's a genetic basis for it and that it can be cured. We have a pretty strong stance right now that says it can't be cured, and we don't want to get anywhere, we don't want to mess up our persuasion in that sense. For these reasons, we would proudly.
I would like to thank the Prime Minister's speech, and now invite the leader of the opposition, Here.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Love this case, Garrett. So, what am I going to do? So, I have 3 lines of analysis, and I'm going to go into some refutation of everything that I brought. So, the first thing I want to bring up is just the obvious scientific research is interactive and cumulative. So, when scientific research is conducted, the way it works is that while you may research an isolated and discrete notion, these notions interact, accumulate, and then result in many different insights and important discoveries that are relevant to understanding the human condition, understanding cures for things, all of these things accumulate. So that is true. And then the reason why this is particularly significant is because we are talking about the genetic basis for a key element of an individual's identity. So not only does scientific research accumulate, so like research about anything, like research about like random arbitrary flies has resulted in a number of very significant cures. This is research not only about humans, but about a specific and hugely significant element of the human condition. To that extent, it has profound implications for pretty much every element of how we define humanity and many different scientific implications. So just basic examples like, if this discovery were made, I can guarantee you it would be published in every most significant scientific journal in the world. I think that it would have huge implications for just general medical science, for sociology, for psychology. All of these different fields would in many ways be contingent on and significantly related to discoveries about the basis of your sexual orientation. To that end, the huge and immense harm of their model is that they are removing the ability or limiting the extent to which we have access to this very significant information. We think that that's a problem. Our second argument is we don't think it's fair for them to say, well, it's harmful for you to know this about yourself, so we shouldn't research it. We think many individuals who are gay, who are not gay, or who hate or love gay people would want to know and would be curious about the basis of sexual identity. In particular, I'll focus on the extent to which gay people should have control and understanding of their sexual identity. Many people who are gay and young struggle with the notion that they wonder, did I choose this? Was this my fault? Is this influenced by this? Parents wonder, how can I raise my kids to avoid this or encourage this? All these types of questions are things that many humans are very curious about and would like to know about. The extent to which the government model precludes or attempts to limit research in this area is limiting the ability, specifically for gay individuals, to understand themselves, to understand the basis for their beliefs and their views, and to let them feel a sense of comfort in knowing that they couldn't control it. So all of his argument about choice being like really bad, it's bad for people to think that it's a choice or not think that it's a choice, is irrelevant because well, it's not relevant, I'll deal with it, but within the area of analysis of the individual who is gay, it's often very important for this individual maybe to know that it is genetically based so that they're not self-loathing within a community who tells them that it's a choice that they've made. We see that as hugely problematic as well. We think that this discovery, in particular, for many individuals due to religious oppressions who feel like they've wronged their community and their family because they end up being gay, would have a huge outlet and a sense of protection from the knowledge that it was based on genetics and not based on the wrong choice that they made in their youth. We think that that's beneficial. Thirdly, we think there's a harm in any government just discouraging research without sufficient basis. So we think it's good for governments to encourage research, which he thinks is particularly important. We think that governments probably would encourage this research in particular because of the profound implications that I discussed earlier. We think but in his model, not only did he say that we will no longer subsidize it, but that the government should actively encourage people to not research it. We are not comfortable with the government saying this element of science should not be researched, because we don't think the government has any means of meaningfully evaluating what should and should not be technologically or scientifically relevant. We think the scientific community should decide what it deems relevant and make decisions based on that. Yes?
We've made that exact same sort of decision in the past. Like, it's no longer okay to try to look at the differences in genetic intelligence between different races, whether science thinks that's a good thing to look at or not.
Okay, so I think that, like I said, certain limitations are placed on certain things. So if someone was like, I want to research how to make a really effective atom bomb or something, and they were like, okay, we're not comfortable with that, you can do a risk calculus. What I'm saying is that all of the profound implications of this research point towards the extent to which it's hugely beneficial and educational. And we don't think that it falls into that category. Absent that, we are not comfortable with the government saying, this is just not the style, like the type of research we're interested in. We think generally that should be dictated by scientists. So moving into reputation. So the first thing that he brought up is a non-point. So we agree that immutability shouldn't be the entire basis on which we evaluate whether or not someone is legitimately being discriminated against. So the first thing he says is that, choice isn't the issue. Choice is totally irrelevant. We shouldn't look at it. I already illustrated how it being a choice actually has significant implications for individuals who are self-loathing within communities who tell them that they've chosen. So I think that element's relevant. Additionally, what I'd say is that choice is relevant. The reason why choice is relevant when you discriminate is because given that it's immutable, there's a sense of unfairness and injustice to place barriers or restrict an individual's happiness or freedom based on something beyond their control. To recognize the extent to which immutability influences how we dictate what should and should not be discriminated against doesn't mean it has to be the exclusive factor. And that's the problem with his analysis. He was saying, well, no, we shouldn't base it on immutability, because whether or not it's a choice, being gay is fine. We agree, but if it were immutable, that's yet another aggravating circumstance to not discriminate against it, because the person has no ability to control that decision. So we think that that's hugely problematic. Additionally, we'd also say that whether or not it is a choice or, never mind, it's genetic instinct. Okay, moving on. So the other thing that they said is that there's no benefit to doing this, so we shouldn't do it. I think all of my first points analysis illustrate how there's a huge benefit to this discovery. So I think that point falls out of the ground. The second argument he raises is eugenics, this notion of aborting gay children. So I don't think that they can win this argument. First of all, Pardeep raises, well, if that's the only problem, then maybe we could just ban that. I recognize that that's a different debate, but to isolate that issue as the reason why we don't do research in an extremely relevant field doesn't justify it if that's the main tangible argument we're identifying. Additionally, I don't think that this is necessarily true that we shouldn't allow people aborting children because they're gay, for a couple reasons. First of all, I think they have to actually prove to us that forcing parents to have gay children who will then hate them and often push those children to kill themselves is not necessarily a good environment. And I think in a Canadian context at least, there are sufficient people who are very happy to have gay children who would not want to abort gay children. And in terms of numbers, I think many gay parents would specifically want to have gay children. So I don't think that necessarily you would have this huge drop-off and then there would no longer be a political movement. Additionally, the political movement for gay rights has tons of inertia amongst gay and non-gay people. So I just don't buy that the gay movement is going to be defeated. Finally, he said that there's medicalization and that people will suppress this gene. I think that that would have ethical implications in terms of research. Researching how to suppress the extent to which someone is gay. And so I think that's dealt with in that. These reasons said proudly in opposition.
I'd like to thank the leader opposite and now invite the Crown up to continue government case with a 7-minute address here.
Excellent, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What I'm going to go through is rebut their arguments, or deliver one new construction, rebut their arguments, and then rebuild my project subpoints. Alright, so the first new and important and really interesting concept that falls on the government side of this round is that, like, what we have when we have this sort of, like, nature versus nurture debate is that gay rights are stronger in the gray area, where we're sort of uncertain. We think that it's relatively clear that most people believe that it's, like, not a choice and that it is something genetic, but we think that, like, being between the gray area actually makes gay rights stronger and more easy to defend. And the reason is this, because if it's just nothing but genetic, then we have these issues of eugenics, and we have these issues of medicalization, which Garrett defended, and we have things like these harms that we've outlaid. If it's nothing but a choice, we also have the harms of people who sort of, like, think that it's an illegitimate choice. Say, you shouldn't make that choice. Like, we sort of fear a future where people, like, have determined that there is no gay gene, it's just a choice, and see being gay as something you flit around with for a while in university. So by being in the gray area, what you manage to do is defend gay rights better than being on either determined side. Because you're uncertain, you manage to both avoid the harms of determining a gay gene and avoid the harms of determining that there isn't a gay gene. And that's why a gray area is actually a strong place for the gay community to be in right at this moment. Alright, so then to go on to, like, refute their points. They said that, like, scientific research is really grand and interactive and cumulative, and we can get, like, good spin-off effects, and, you know, various disciplines will be really interested in this research. And we agreed that the scientific community would look at this research, whatever it, like, revealed, and be like, hey, this is really cool. But we don't think that the scientific community does a good job of legislating harms for individuals. That's what governments are for. And we think it's the individual, like, scientific communities just, like, are generally indifferent to that fact. We've watched scientific communities build atom bombs and genetic weapons and things like that. So what we think is that, like, even though, like, sure, scientists would be interested, but the fact that we have harms on our side, which I'll definitely rebuild and defend, means that we don't care that scientists would, like, have a lot of fun with this. We have to consider the harms. That's, like, what governments do, yeah.
Yeah, so governments are the ones who did things like the eugenics program that you're discussing. And governments actually are the people who built the atom.
Yeah, and, like, we agree that governments make mistakes here too, but that's why we're applying the harm principle in a rational way. Like they said, you know, we've got to evaluate it through a basic calculation here. You're right, that's what side government is doing in this round. That's why we gave you benefits to not discovering a gay gene and harms to discovering a gay gene. That's, like, the point of our case, guys. Alright, so, like, that covers that issue. Alright, so then the next point is that, like, gay communities will, like, really, gay people really want to know, and that, like, parents really want to know, and how this is limiting people to, like, limiting people's opportunity for the comfort of being like, no, it's just genetic, it wasn't actually a choice we made. We think the vast majority of people, like, already believe this without scientific evidence. We don't think the harm is that strong. Like, we think, like, the gay community has done a very good job of sending out the message. It's not a choice, especially with the famous joke that that Garrett mentioned, which was, when did you first decide that you were straight? Like, it's clear that the gay community has sent out this message that it is genetic, even if there's no evidence, and that, like, as such, this harm of, like, gay people being really confused and concerned that they made some mistaken choice, we don't think actually exists yet.
Okay, if everyone already believes that it's genetic, and you're using that as an argument to suggest that the benefits are limited, then certainly the harms are limited as well.
The thing is, yeah, we agree that, like, on the side of, like, the gay community having issues with people making the choice, yeah, the benefit there is limited. That's why we give you 2 harms and 1 benefit. Is because, like, I think the harms of eugenics and the harms of, like, medicalization, which I'm going to further rebuild in a few moments, actually are, like, the most significant parts of this. My little interesting thing about, like, Wright's position in the, like, gray area being stronger, like, that's why it's in the MC speech, guys. Hello. Like, it's interesting and cool, but, like, we care about the harms a lot. Alright, yeah, so that covers the second point. The third point was regarding, like, this concern that government says science shouldn't be researched. Like, Garrett pointed out that there were restrictions in, like, a POI, and, like, we think that given the harm principle and given the evaluation of harms that we're doing, like, it's clear that this is a reasonable place to restrict the science. Yeah, so it's clear that, like, I really need to, like, most do is deal with the rebuttal and strongly rebuild the harms that we presented. So the first harm that was, like, really important and really concerning for us is this avenue for eugenics and avoiding gay children. And they said 2 things, that 1, like, some parents won't do it, and 2, that some parents that would do it would have, like, do terrible things to their gay children, and that's really concerning. First of all, we think that, like, diminishing the gay community is difficult for the gay community to deal with. But more importantly, people who, like, have been very instrumental and very important to, like, changing people's perceptions are the people that have familiar relationships. The first thing that's going to get a hardcore conservative or hardcore Republican to reconsider their ideology is going to be having a gay kid. Because we think that's the thing that's going to touch them the most. And we think that, like, that's good for the gay community. And that the gay community has got lots of strong activists out of people that maybe haven't had perfect upbringings. Either way, having them aborted is a harm for the gay community, and also we think is actually a harm for that hardcore crazy conservative, because we actually think it's a benefit for the hardcore crazy conservative to be open-minded and to learn more about the world, and to, like, actually, like, reevaluate their terrible position. So we think that either way, that's, like, this harm of eugenics and this opportunity is actually a concern. And then in regards to the medicalization point, there was a slight contradiction there where they were concerned about the government saying, no, you can't research, but they're also, like, concerned about the government being, like failing to support this research because they actually really want to support this research. And we think that, like, no, all the evidence we have says that we shouldn't be supporting this research. Going back, so on the medicalization, we think that, like, we see lots of issues with medicalization of communities in regards to, like, making things look like a disorder. And that, like, by having this as a medical issue, a genetic issue, we get this sense that, like, oh, we could fix these people by just, like, suppressing their genes. And because of this, like, we think that that's fundamentally harmful to, like, the gay community and people who, like, participate in this lifestyle. As such, because standing between the gray area is better, and because we've demonstrated substantial harms, we're proud to propose. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank the Minister Brown for his speech, and now invite the member opposite up to deliver a 7-minute speech.
Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker. I'll be doing 2 things for you in today's speech. First, I'll be going through what we've heard so far from outside government and why it doesn't stand up to my reputation analysis. And then I'll be showing you what Josh already said, why all that's still standing, and therefore, as the debate stands right now, off should be winning. So, let's look at what government said so far. Well, the fact is, ladies and gentlemen, government's essentially given us a case for why society in the 1950s shouldn't have known that being gay is genetic. They've given us a bunch of things that if society were horribly homophobic, could be harms of society knowing there's a gay gene. Unfortunately, we on side opposition understand that society can be trusted with this knowledge. We on side opposition are staking our flag in the fact that even if society does know there's a gene that makes you gay, we're not going to have widespread eugenics programs. And we're not going to have medicalization of being gay, where we classify being gay, in the DSM-4 as being a mental disorder. We don't think those things are going to happen. We think that's the failure of side proposition. They've told you why having these eugenics programs and having this medicalization are harmful. They failed to show how modern society would necessarily come to these things simply if we knew the genetic basis of being gay. So let's look in more specifics what side propositions talk to you about so far. Firstly, they talk to you about the immutability of being gay. And they had a couple things to say about this that Josh hasn't dealt with already. They said the argument is strongest when we deal in the gray area. When we deal in the area where we're not saying it's a choice and we're not saying that it's not a choice. And we think, frankly, that that's a ridiculous thing to say. We think the argument is sufficiently strong whether or not you are in the gray area, or if you say it's not a choice. Furthermore, if we accept there is a gay gene, and if we accept it actually is genetic, then we think it's ridiculous for side proposition to say we shouldn't be finding the truth simply because a falsehood is a more convenient argument. We think that that is absolutely ridiculous. We think we would rather seek the truth, especially when we on side opposition would say that that if being gay is genetically based, we can still defend the rights of gay people to be gay. And we think side proposition hasn't sufficiently shown us the harms. And they talked about pedophilia. They said, well, what if we find out pedophilia is genetic? Does that mean suddenly that's not wrong? No, absolutely not. There's a clear difference. The difference is pedophilia is wrong. Even if it's immutable, it's still wrong. Whereas being gay is not morally wrong. Therefore, if we find out it's immutable, it's completely different from finding out pedophilia is immutable. Secondly, let's look at the issue of eugenics. Before I do that, I'll take it.
Yeah, we agree that the good debaters in this room will be happy with this, but we're concerned about places like the southern US where we don't think that gay rights are sufficiently defended, and we do think we take advantage of something like that.
Yes, thank you. We don't think the South is going to take advantage of this if the government is strong enough to stop them from taking advantage of it. We trust the government to say you can't abort gay babies the same way we trust the government to say you can't kill your gay child. And yes, maybe some people in the South hate their gay child, but we trust us to stop them from being harmed. So let's look at the issue of eugenics. And we think that the real harm here is they kept talking about how if we let a Southern Baptist family have a gay baby, they'll start believing gay people are people too. We think the real harm here is it's not our right to decide for this child they're going to be our political tool. We don't think it's our right to say this child's allowed to have a hard life simply because it's going to further the gay rights movement, especially when we feel the gay rights movement is sufficiently strong without subjecting this child to this horrible, difficult life. We would say, first of all, the government can be trusted to stop gay eugenics from happening. And second of all, those families that so strongly hate having a gay child that they would circumvent these laws, maybe they shouldn't be having a gay child. Maybe a gay child being in this family would be sufficiently harmed that we don't want this to be happening to this child. And lastly, let's look at medicalization. They said, if we know it's genetic, therefore we'll classify it as a disorder. Frankly, once again, that's ridiculous. We know the genetic basis of racial differences, we know the genetic basis of gender differences, and yet being brown or being female aren't classified as disorders. Again, what side government hasn't shown us is why having medical basis necessarily means we'll take this horribly negative stance. Yes, it could be taken, but we believe in a modern, intelligent, just society, it won't be taken. So let's look at what Josh has talked to you about so far. And we had 3 arguments from Josh. Why it's good for science, why people want to know, and why restricting science is harmful. So firstly, we think the argument that side government had to our analysis of why it's good for science to allow this research to happen was incredibly flippant. They said scientists will enjoy it, therefore that's what side opposition is saying. That's ridiculous. Frankly, we don't care if scientists are having fun. What we care about is the fact that the research these scientists are doing could be genuinely beneficial. We can go back to, for instance, pedophilia. If we start to find out the genetic basis of different sexual orientations, maybe we could find out the genetic basis of, say, pedophilia or other psychological disorders that we actually should be curing. We think there are a lot of legitimate medical benefits to doing this research, and we think limiting this area of research is incredibly harmful. They talked about research into differences between intelligence and race and tried to link these two, and that's ridiculous. Why do we limit this research? Because we feel this research is wrong, and because we feel this research isn't predicated on actual medical knowledge, but instead on biases and racism. That's why we don't allow this research. We think research into the gauging can absolutely be objective and beneficial. We can study the genetic differences between races, and in the same way we think we should be able to study the genetic differences between different sexual groups. And why do people want to know? Once again, they were rather flippant about this. They said, well, people know anyway, and then a little bit of tension here. First they were saying the gay rights movement shouldn't say being gay is genetic. Then they said it's great that the gay rights movement has convinced everyone that it's genetic. But even if we ignore this tension, the fact is, we think the people who think it's genetic would still like to be supported in this by actual scientific background, and that's why these people would benefit. And lastly, why is it good that we're not restricting science? What it comes down to is that, yes, like side government said, science doesn't care about harms. However, the government shouldn't be stopping scientific progress when they're caring about harms. They should be stopping bad things being done with this medical progress. Yes, if we find out, for instance, how bird flu can become airborne, this could be used to make weapons, but it can also be used to fight bird flu, and it's up to the government to make sure that research is being used well, not to limit research. So for these reasons, this resolution must absolutely fall. Thank you.
Include side officer's case with the 3 minutes each, no POI, no new argument.
So basic, what are the benefits? What are the costs? What are the benefits? To science, generally, huge benefits. I think we've explained. In terms of understanding the human condition, so beyond science, different fields, academic fields, huge benefits. In terms of allowing an exit and a rationalization for not being self-loathing as a young gay individual who feels oppressed within their community, huge benefits. When they tell us that many people already believe it's genetics, the few people who don't believe that, especially, are the people who have it beaten into them that it is a choice that they've made and they need to correct it. For those individuals, it will be a huge benefit. A free scientific community, which is making decisions based on helpful scientific research, is a huge benefit. And finally, this may protect some gay children from being forced through the hell of being raised in a Southern Baptist community, feeling in no way respected or accepted within their community, and inevitably killing themselves. We think all of these are reasons why discovering and pursuing this research is a huge benefit. What are the costs? We don't think there are any. So first of all, they tell us there will be a weaker gay rights movement. They predicate this argument on the idea that it will undermine the choice argument that can be made. The issue with this, like they said, is that this argument is kind of silly. Most people don't subscribe to it. Only super hyper-conservative Christians do. Is that the group that we're fighting with, really? Is that the main battleground of the gay rights movement? Or is the battleground of the gay rights movement the margins where people are unsure as to whether or not they should be accepting of homosexuality? At the end of the day, people who have doctrinal beliefs against homosexuality are likely not going to be that convinced. However, people on the margins could be thoroughly convinced through many arguments in no way related to this. So I do not buy that the gay rights movement will be significantly undermined by this research. I think, if anything, the extent to which it further informs our understanding of the human condition and likens homosexuality to other things like race and gender, if anything, strengthens the gay rights movement. And then they raise two other risks. First, they raise the risk of eugenics. We already illustrated how maybe you would just ban that. We'd also say, as my partner illustrated in his argument, that we just don't think it's reasonable to force gay kids through trauma for a societal benefit. Why is that? We think it's placing an unreasonable burden on these individuals, but additionally, even if it were hyper-effective, we think it's completely unnecessary. Because the gay rights movement is not contingent and wholly based on hyper-conservative Southern families having gay kids. It's based on various ways in which media and people communicate as to why gay rights should be respected. It's based on things like that ad that was posted all over Facebook from Australia about how gay rights should be expected. It's based on Wanda Sykes ads where she says you shouldn't use the word fag pejoratively. It's based on Ellen DeGeneres standing up to movements within the Southern United States opposed to homosexuality. None of these are defeated based on a gay gene. So I just don't think that the gay rights movement is undermined. Finally, they raise this medicalization argument. two responses. First of all, they haven't really thoroughly explained what they really mean by it, but it sounds like it could have ethical implications which wouldn't allow it anyways. But the extent to which you could have legitimate investigation on gene suppression has humongous benefits, right? So that essentially means if you do gain beneficial research as to how we can suppress genes, many disorders and significant diseases are based on gene expression, and if you learn how to suppress those, then that's great. That's a science argument. Probably be good.
I'd like to take the opposite, and now invite the Prime Minister to conclude this debate with a 3-minute address, no POIs, no new arguments.
So essentially in my rebuttal, I want to talk about two big harms that are relevant to this debate. The first one is going to be a harm that we hear from opposition. It's the harm of forcing someone to be gay when we have the ability to prevent that from happening. When we have the ability to prevent from medicalizing that, or from preventing them to be born to begin with and committing suicide later. Right? Like, that's a lot of what they say. They say it's like harmful for us to force somebody to be gay when we have the research that says like, hey, that family didn't have to raise that gay child, or hey, you could take these drugs and then you don't have to deal with that discrimination. Right? Like, they think that it's really harmful for us to force people to do that. So this is a really strange argument that they make, right? Like, we don't think it requires a horribly negative stance of society for us to allow that kind of thing, or for people to start aborting, for people to start medicalizing, right? We think that it's a reasonable stance, right? Not wanting your kid to be gay in a discriminatory community, or not wanting to be gay in a discriminatory community, with huge negative implications, right? So we think it's a reasonable chance that trusting society has nothing to do with it, because reasonable people will make that choice, right? But the huge negative implications is that there are fewer gay people, fewer avenues, fewer outlets, fewer benefits of the movement in terms of how strong it is. So I think that's problematic. And in terms of that harm, like, it's really silly, because they were like, oh, and you know, if it really is that bad, you can step in and like prevent abortion or prevent medicalization, right? But like that's a contradiction there, because in one side they're saying that like not preventing it, like not allowing people to make the choice is going to be helpful, is harmful to those people, right? But then they say we could step in and prevent them from making the choice if it was a problem, right? Like, we hear those two avenues coming from opposition, and they're entirely contradictory, right? So I've clarified the harm there. The harm there is they think people are making reasonable decisions with huge negative repercussions in that sense. We don't think it's that harmful to force somebody to grow up gay when there are benefits for their broader gay community. Like, and in terms of the gray area point, that comes up here too, we think it's better. Like, we don't have to force people to be gay if we don't look for the gay gene to begin with, right? Like, we can just be like, hey, they'll all be gay because they were gay. And we don't have to make that huge ethical decision about whether we should force them to be gay or allow them to have the choice or not. Again, the gray area is benefit. So that deals with the biggest harm we hear from that side. Let's talk about a big harm we hear from this side, right? We think diminishing the gay community, diminishing where gays tend to arise and the diversity of exposure is harmful to gay rights. We think that things you hear from Wanda Sykes and Ellen DeGeneres have suasion because there are lots of gays around, right? And people are forced to interact with them and be exposed to them, right? So we think it's harder for you to deal with that question when there's fewer gay people. And when you're talking about the rights of a gay child who, it's not fair to allow them to grow up in this society, we think ensuring that there's lots of avenues for exposure and lots of avenues for them to interact with other gay people helps deal with that issue, right? There are going to be some gay people, and the discrimination is greater the more of a minority they become, right? So we don't think we should allow that to diminish in that sense. So we think, like, in terms of those two big harms, we win the round on that. But in terms of this gray area, what I just want to conclude on is we think what we get by not seeking this out is we get the benefits of assuming that gayness is genetic without the harms of knowing that gayness is genetic, right? Because you don't get those harms